it's here that I'd like to discuss the process of making this falcon and my reflections on the outcomes, which took different forms. I wasn't too happy with some outcomes, and so shifted and morphed it into something else. Mainly, I took it from a plate that was 2D and mounted on a wall to being 3D or wearable on a pendant chain. So I'll start at the beginning. So in January, February, with moving closer to uni to have access to the hearth and the metal workshops, I undertook my largest scale Mokume to date, and I used tooling which I created, which is these mild steel plates and these screws to add uniform pressure to the billet while I was forging it. So the only thing to note here in my billet stack in development, or my evolution on Realisations' billet stack that I showed previously, is that I put the thick plate in the middle so that I could have thinner plates at the top and bottom, so that I could pattern from top and bottom in a way that would expose more layers. And this is a really good diagram taken from the same place that was describing the Mokume process of the Tiffany & Co. vase, and it shows the different ways that you can pattern Mokume, because this is the 3D cross section of the metal, and this is what it looks like from the top once it's been flattened. So you can bore into it, and the amount of layers that you go into it, then when you flatten it, looks like this. So all of these channels were dug out with this carbide bit into the pattern here, and I also did the reverse of this, which is I punched down, which pushed the layers down in this sort of pattern, and then when you file away, it just leaves the this sort of pattern. So I punched the trees and the mountain and the clouds seen here, and I also filed away down like this. I filed away at the edges, and then I also used the carbide tip to drill out the pattern of the falcon. So what I did was fused the stack. Here it is glowing red hot, and I used a manual press to press it all together while it was red hot, and this is what the billet looks like when it comes out. Here's a brass leak, and brass leaks can severely detriment the quality of the billet, and you don't find out the quality of the billet until hours into hammering it. So this probably took maybe 8 hours total of hammering to get it from a billet stack this thick like this into something about half the thickness of this. And so it evolved into patterning, which is at about 50% size, and this is what it looks like post pattern. And the other thing to note is the reason that this is an evolution on a tuba. I wanted to make a tuba, and this is what this cutout here is to add to cut this out and put the katana, the blade of the sword, into here, so it would be a sword guard, because I wanted to make a tuba. But as these two demonstrate, I had the harrowing experience of the billet splitting, which meant that I could no longer use it, I could no longer pattern it. And so luckily I was making two billets at the same time, but this is a direct result of brass spillage. When it spills out, the layers don't fuse and you get delamination. I moved on because I was making two at the same time, because my failure rate is about 50-60%. I tend to make 2 or 3 billets at the same time, just so that I can process them in tandem, hammer them in tandem, pattern them in tandem, and then if one fails, I'm working on the other. So this is the failed one here, these three, and then this is the successful one, the Falcon. And here's what I would call a process picture, but it's also a realization or an outcome, and it's my favorite of all of them, because here are the patterns still 3-dimensional, and then I hammered it out, and this is what it looks like flat. And then in the polishing process, I lost a lot of the definition and the detail in the clouds and the trees and everything over here. It's a lot harder to see the clouds and the definition of the mountain and things. But what I really liked in talking to people is that they could still recognize the bird of prey, the falcon, in the central piece, which is ultimately what I'm so proud of doing, and what I set my intention of doing when I did this project, was to try and get a zoomorphic form cast into metal, a representation of humanity's reflection on nature, and I got it in. And so when I was showing this to Helena Goldwater last week, I handed it to her with no context, and she was like, "Oh, I really like the bird of prey. It looks really good." And I was like, "Oh, I'm so glad that you can tell that it's a bird of prey, because that's all I cared about." And she's like, "Oh, I can tell, but I also like the fact that I have to work to find it. I have to sort of glint it in the light to sort of see this pattern, and it's not immediately apparent." And that's exactly what I wanted with this piece. And the other thing I'll note is when the reason I took it from a 2D piece to a 3D piece is because on a 2D plane, the reflections are quite static, and the glint across the light and dark parts doesn't allow that revelatory process in the same way that it would if it was worn. And in discussions with a lot of the jewelry students, where they're like, oh, I really like that this has heft, it's got density, it's a real like solid object, it would be great to see the reflections playing off the surface as a wearable item. So I added loops to the back of it so that I could turn it into a pendant, and now it's a wearable pendant that I can walk around and the light catches off it on different sides. And so I finished it in this platinol oxidizing solution, which looks like this, and that's my favorite final form or realization of this piece. But then I sort of eroded away at the central part so that it looks more like an object that had been dug up like 400 years ago or gone through time. And it's this whole idea of setting into material something and then it being picked up hundreds of years in the future, and people looking at it as a casting into material of time, because we don't know how long these animals or things will be around for. And falcons are very elusive creatures anyway, and so I think that's perhaps one of my favorite reasons for depicting them, is because they're very hard to see in nature and you only see them fleetingly. And as the fastest creature on the planet, diving at 200 miles an hour, it's just beautiful to cast into metal the ephemeral nature of this bird in sort of like a mimetic form. Just the same with cherry blossoms, they're only out for a week, and it's just nice to cast that. And here's the cherry blossom punches. There were a lot more. Unfortunately, they didn't really come through in the final outcome, but that's part of my reflections on this. And then perhaps my favorite part of this entire thing is taking it from a polished copper and brass unfinished plate, and here's the reflection of my face, into the final form, and in adding the patina solution, which I'm doing here with the brush strokes. I got halfway, and here's my reflection on one half, and it's being marred on the other half. And I see this as a performative piece as well, in the sense that it's the revelation of months of work, the revelation of casting into material a creature. And here we go. So thank you. One thing I forgot to mention about the process of creating this was development on failure at the final stage, which was I had it perfectly polished in this plate. This is pre-patina, and then I tried adding a patina that I usually use, liver of sulfur, and that's what this looked like, and it really did not look good at all. What I was going for was the copper to go black and the brass to say a brass shiny color, so that the brass would glint and shine and the black would stay muted. But liver of sulfur just made the whole thing muted, and thus I had to refinish it. And so in the process of sanding this down to refinish it, I made a huge mistake. And this is something I did in the metal workshop. I was using a belt sander, and I was trying to sand the surface of this and the edges as well. And the belt sander ate it because I was using the wrong tool and I used it at the wrong angle, and it literally just ate it into the machine. And the machine was going, and I was, minutes away from finishing this piece, and I was gutted because I didn't know how bad the damage would be. And overall, it wasn't too bad. It just gouged this or sanded this lump into it. So when you look at the final piece really closely, you will see a slight indent. I did try to sand it out, but the more I sanded out, the more pattern I would lose. So I overcame that by just continuing on and not letting it get me, because I was really disappointed at this point, and it took maybe 3-4 hours to go from a piece that was essentially finished and just needed a new patina to a piece that needed reworking with machines and files and sanding and refinishing the surface and then repatinaing. So with the billet failing and this happening, I had a lot of difficulties. And one other thing I'll say is I mentioned this brass leak, and when I talk about this process being extremely nuanced, the tutors are really fascinated with my process because they've never seen this before, especially in the metal workshop. And so I was talking to them about this sweet spot at which all of these separate layers become one, and you start seeing it when the metal starts sweating. I saw it start sweating, and I called a tutor over, and I was like, this is the point where it happens. And in looking away and turning away to the tutor to show him this, I let it get past the sweating point and into the melting point. And that's what caused this brass leak. It's genuinely about 4 or 5 seconds of looking away and not moderating the heat in the way that I should have been. And that's a lesson I've learned, is just complete focus. But I think that's another part of why I love this process, is because it demands complete focus. It demands being in the moment and nothing else. And that's why I say the creation of this is almost a performance to some extent, because I get locked in and I must, just do this. And so the jewelry department were kind enough to let me, once I negotiated with the heads of our department and their department, if I could go in. I was lucky enough to forge a billet in their department over the Easter break. It was hilarious because all of the jewelry students hadn't seen a process like this at all. And in taking this red hot thing, this whole thing glowing red hot from one place over to the press, the other side of the other side of the room, I had an audience about 5-6 people, and it really felt like a performance piece, a bit like this, because it's a revelation of process which people hadn't seen. So I do see a lot of process and realization to be interlinked, and those that see me creating tend to understand this more than I can really speak out or explain through this PDF. But yeah, those are my final notes on this. Thank you.